He was starting to talk about, I'm not going back to prison. I'm going to shoot it out with the cops.
Hey gang, I guarantee if you're watching the main channel, you're seeing these videos of people in self-defense encounters all the time. People start bleeding, they start bleeding fast. And we as self-defenders should be interested in all the tools that can protect and preserve innocent life, and good trauma gear can do that. It's just as important as a firearm, maybe more so. Listen, trauma is trauma. Whether it's a vehicle accident, a farming accident, or a gunshot wound, when seconds count, you need the right equipment for the job. You must get your trauma gear from a reputable source, and Mountain Man Medical is ASP's go-to source for all of our medical gear. Go to mountainmanmedical.com and let them know you heard about them on the Ask Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. I am your host, Mike Williver, your favorite former Fed. With me today, my good friend, Mike Doyle. He is a police officer in southern Arizona. He is a canine handler and a SWAT team member, also a medic. But other than that, doesn't have a lot going on, police-wise. Mike, how are you?
I'm awesome.
He is also the host, before I forget, and we'll bring this up later, of the Tactical Tangents podcast, the co-host with his friend Jim. And that show comes out on the
1st and the 15th of every month.
It is a phenomenally interesting show. If you're in the world of law enforcement, military, anything like that, I highly recommend it. It's a very good show, and I think you'd enjoy it a tremendous amount. So, Mike, are you a native of southern Arizona?
No, I grew up in Southern California, where I started as an EMT back in the day. And like a lot of people that lived in Southern California for too long, I had to get out. Found myself in Arizona.
You and me had that in common. I'm from Maryland originally, but I spent 23 years in San Diego County working as a Fed, working on task forces and stuff. And while I enjoyed my time there, it was time to go when I moved out here to beautiful Tucson, Arizona. So growing up, did you always know that you wanted to be a police officer? No,
it wasn't really on my radar. I had a knack for doing things related to helping people in some way or another. One of the pivotal, I guess, kind of life stories for me was when I was real young. I had a friend who was blind. I was probably 10 or 11 years old, 5th grade, 4th grade, something like that. And he got picked on the playground. Some kid was trying to start a fight with him and started pushing him around. And so I stepped in and I ended up fighting the guy. And in the aftermath of that, I was actually thanked. The school principal thanked me. The mom thanked me and stuff. And so that was I think a telling event in my life for where I'd probably end up, but I didn't really have law enforcement specifically pegged. I explored careers in the military, careers in search and rescue, EMS, and then I just kind of landed in law enforcement.
So you mentioned a moment ago you were in the first responder community in SoCal in a medical capacity. So you were a paramedic or an EMT, or what were you there?
I was an EMT. I worked on a paramedic ambulance in San Bernardino County, but I was just an EMT.
I wouldn't say just. I know people that have gone through EMT training, and it's no joke. It's a lot. There's a lot involved there, especially in Cali. So no small feat. So you joined your department 13 years ago, and tell us about the basic sort of initial training of a police academy in general, because I know a lot of folks listening to this show probably are interested in a career in law enforcement and want to know what that's like. So the selection process is usually pretty long and involved and laborious, lots of interviews and PT tests and backgrounds and polygraphs. But once you get through all that, generally speaking, what can a person expect when they arrive at a police academy?
Interestingly, and I guess this isn't really a surprise to anybody, but so much has changed in the last 10, 15 years in law enforcement. The academy itself is ambitious, I think, is the best way to describe the syllabus of a police academy. All of the things that you have to teach people, so much of the time must be spent on the academics. And some of that is very important academics. It's contextually understanding where constitutional law fits into policing and things like that. And there's also a lot that's very, very specific, like the game and fish laws and the liquor laws and all of the traffic laws. And those things can be kind of tedious as well. And so a lot of people, I think, sign up to be a cop because they think they're going to carry a gun and drive fast and get in foot chases and fights and all kinds of stuff. Or at least that's how it was back when I started. I think maybe the allure of that has changed quite a bit, but people grew up in my generation watching Cops, right? The TV show. And that's what they saw. They saw car chases and crashes and foot chases and fights and all those things. And it's amazing how little time you spend actually doing those things. So I think you have to get up for that in a couple of ways. One is you have to be academically oriented. You can't just be the guy that thinks that he's going to show up and brute force his way through this stuff. And you also can't be the person who thinks that, like, well, I've got the brains, I've got the smarts, I'm going to talk my way out of every problem, because you will find yourself woefully underprepared when you leave the academy. You will have a basic grasp of firearms handling and proficiency. You will have a pocket full of skills when it comes to fighting and going hands-on with people, which is problematic. In the realm of law enforcement, we call the arrest and control tactics oftentimes defensive tactics. But the reality of being a police officer is there is very little that is defensive about defensive tactics. You are closing with and arresting people against their will in many cases, and that is an offensive posture, right? So you're going to be woefully underprepared in that realm. And frankly, if you have even just a little bit of physical fitness, you're going to be just fine, because a lot of the people who show up are not going to have very much in the way of physical fitness. And so some people will find themselves underprepared in that realm. So I know, we'll talk about this later, but that was a big impetus for me starting my own project as a side hustle, was to try to close that gap a little bit, if you will.
John and I do the badge cam videos on the main channel, and we're always discussing the fact that if you're a law enforcement officer of any kind, federal, state, local, probation, parole, whatever the case may be, your basic training and your in-service training are woefully insufficient as far as getting you prepared for the streets and for anything that might come down. You've got to go out and get training on your own, unless you work for some amazingly progressive agency that, stands you down for 2 weeks every year, and you do some kind of crazy amount of training. But most places aren't doing that.
Well, and the thing is there are certainly those staffing challenges in making that happen and pulling people off the road to go do training. That is a challenge at the management level, by all means.
Sure.
And it is also an individual challenge for a lot of people to find time, money, and bandwidth outside of work to go do stuff on their own. But what we have found is that in many cases, even when we offer training to members of the department, free jiu-jitsu seminars, for example,
nobody shows up.
Yeah, you might get a handful of guys, and that's, I think, a sad state of affairs to be in. And it really speaks to what we need to do a better job internally within our organizations and among our peers of, creating that culture of accountability, which is something that, I would like to say that has come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years, but I could be fooling myself. I don't know.
Yeah, I recall one of my academy instructors during PT, we were doing defensive tactics. Now that you said that, I'll never look at the term defensive tactics the same way again. But we're in the mat room, we're fighting each other, we're hitting each other with foam batons and doing arrest techniques, and I wasn't giving 100%, and I knew I wasn't at that moment. And this guy comes over, one of the instructors, and he's like, "Do you think you're going to rise to the occasion somehow magically in the field when some super fit parolee is trying to murder you? Because that's not the way this works. Not any of this works. You got to get ready now and train now." Talk to us about canine handling in general and the training that goes into not only you but the dog, because I think people might think that, you become a cop and after a few years and they just give you a dog. He's like your best friend, and you guys just skip and frolic throughout the city, and you just somehow magically know what to do. There is a lot of very intensive training that goes into training you, the officer, the handler, and then training the dog. So can you give us kind of a 30,000 foot view of what that looks like?
Sure. So the first thing is that being a canine handler, and there's lots of different types of dogs and handlers out there, detection dogs, tracking dogs, patrol dogs. So from my perspective, what I am generally referring to, I work with a dual purpose canine. He's a detection dog and also a patrol or apprehension dog. So his job is to go find and catch bad guys, right? So he bites people, he searches buildings, he searches areas, and he, as kind of a side gig, he also can do detection work, right? So everyone's experience is going to be kind of unique to what kind of dog they're working around. But the biggest thing is that you have to view the dog as a tool. A lot of people think that, like, you know what I need to do? I need to go get a dog, and suddenly my job is going to be so much different. One of the things that we spend the most time teaching new handlers are the scenarios that are not scenarios for a dog, so that they start to realize that just because you have the dog doesn't mean it's the most appropriate thing to use in that time. So I think just being a good cop and having good tactics, good decision making, being well-rounded in a lot of different proficiency skills and areas, that's probably the first. If you're looking at 30,000 feet, that's probably the first thing. And the second part of it is, I think most canine handlers take personally that their dog's performance is a reflection of them. And the reason I bring that up is because there is always stuff to work on, and it's not always the sexy stuff, right? Yeah, it looks really cool when you see the guy tackle the dude in the bite suit in a field at a canine demo somewhere. Sure.
Right.
That's fun, right? But you would be amazed at how much time I have to spend practicing, and it's largely for the dog's sake, but it also is for me a little bit, right? But like practicing getting the dog out of the car in a hurry and making sure that he's in the right state of mind when that door pops open, that this is what's going to happen next. This is the job or the task that's required of him.
Right.
And, stupid things like walking past other animals and making sure that he's kind of neutral and doesn't respond with any kind of aggression, but also doesn't get distracted by other dogs and cats in yards. Working with a SWAT team, it's just getting him around other members of the team. And I have to ask buddies on my SWAT team, like, hey, can you go put all your gear on and go stand in a room and do these stupid exercises where you're going to pop up from kneeling to standing, lay prone, and I'm just going to walk my dog around and get him used to that. That doesn't sound real fun, right? But it's necessary. So it is a lot of work, to your point. But again, it's a reflection of you. And as we like to say, it goes down the leash.
Right. I think something else people don't realize from the outside looking in on a canine officer or deputy or agent is the immense liability that you have if your dog isn't properly trained. Your dog, the minute you give the command for your dog to release, the dog has to release 100% of the time, because at that moment there's a use of force and liability issue where if the person's now compliant and your dog's in the middle of biting him, if you say stop biting him and the dog keeps gnawing away on the guy, that's a problem. You're going to have civil liability down the road. Isn't that correct?
It is correct. I think there's an interesting point of discussion, though, to happen about the dichotomy of having a quote-unquote well-trained dog and what that means, right? Because one of the things that a handler or one of our trainers told me early on was, you always want your dog kind of on that fence of in control, but not in too much control. And this is important because when I ask my dog to go do things, right, like he's going to go search a building by himself away from me, I need him to have a little bit of independence.
Sure.
And he needs to face that with courage. And if he's afraid from being too far away or not listening, that, he thinks he's going to get corrected for biting somebody when that's what I need him to do. It's an interesting balance, and I think there's a discussion that has to happen there. But one of the more interesting concepts that's helped me in canine work has been the term management, and I stole that from another dog trainer somewhere. It's not my own concept, but when you realize that, yeah, you have an attack dog at the end of the leash, and you also realize that he's a dog. He's not going to be 100% perfect. Anyone with a street dog that has, a couple dozen deployments with that dog is going to tell you that their dog's not always going to have a perfect out just right on command. That's just not, you cannot rely on that. And so everything that you do with that dog has to kind of have that in the back of your head that, hey, if I get this dog out of the car or I drop the leash, I'm writing that dog a check. And we don't know quite how many zeros are at the back of it, right?
Just as an aside, a fun story about back in San Diego, I was on one of the task forces, and we had a dog, not a biter, a sniffer. By the way, let me digress. I was in Georgia for training, and there happened to be a canine and a handler involved with it. And I asked him, "What does your dog do?" And he says, "A little sniffing, a little nibbling." Anyway, so back to San Diego. This task force had a drug dog. He was just a sniffer. I think it was like a golden retriever or something like that. And his name was Kilo. I think that was a little ambitious of a name for this dog. So, the first time I worked with him, we were out on a scene and we'd already cleared a place and we found the dope. And it was kilos of cocaine, and they brought the dog in just for some training before we did anything else. The dog went through and didn't hit on a thing, not a single thing. And this was fresh from the border, so it was still packaged, but still probably should have detected it. And they brought him through again, and he failed again, and then he failed on another search warrant to find something. So his name went from Kilo to Teener, and then finally we dubbed him Pipe Scrape. That was his name by the end of it. Yeah, anyway. So I assume, I have dogs. I love my dogs. But I think it's important also to note that a working canine is not like a regular dog. And there's times when you have to send a dog like that into a really bad situation. So there has to be, I would imagine, there has to be a little bit of, I don't know what the word is, detachment, or I think you know what I'm getting at here, between Absolutely. You and the dog, where you could be sending the dog into a situation where he might not come out. And you can't not fall in love with the dog. I mean, the dog's got your back. You're together for hours, hours and hours every day. So talk to us just about that. When you send the dog into a building knowing he might not come back out, what's that like?
Well, first of all, our team leaders on a SWAT team do the same thing every time some investigator calls them and says, "Hey, this is what we got." And our team leaders go, "Okay, yeah, we'll go after that guy. Mm-hmm. We're going to serve that warrant. We're going to go resolve that barricaded fugitive. We're going to go do whatever it is that we do." Our TLs are thinking about, hey, these are my guys, and I'm sending them into harm's way, right? And so with that comes kind of that personal liability from the, liability is not the right word, but just the moral and ethical kind of baggage that comes with that. Like, is this the right thing to do? Have I prepared him for this sort of scenario? Is he set up for success? Is this an appropriate use of my guys, right? And also the professional liability of, well, what happens if we have a bad outcome, right? Was it worth it?
Sure.
Is this going to pass the headline test? Am I able to look one of my guys' spouse in the face and say, hey, I went and sent your husband or your boyfriend or whatever into some crack den at 2:00 in the morning to go arrest some dude selling dime bags of oregano. I mean, was it worth it, right? So the working relationship is not much different, I think, than how my TLs, I imagine, do that calculus kind of in their head. And so, sure, I have a working relationship with my dog, and I know that my dog as a tool, he is there to be out in front and be forward in lieu of putting an officer in that position, right? So if I send my dog out in front and he gets shot or killed or stabbed or whatever, it is a better outcome than one of my human colleagues getting shot or stabbed or killed or whatever, right? So it's not like we certainly don't take that lightly. It's not like we don't have that in the back of our mind that, hey, you might have to pat that guy on the head one day and send him in and not see him again. I mean, that's certainly part of it. And it doesn't diminish the relationship that you have with your dog by any stretch, but it does help you kind of take a sober approach to risk in general, because anywhere that I send him, I have to assume that I'm going to, right? At some point, he's going to be dealing with bad guy, and I'm going to have to go take him off and arrest the guy. So, it's kind of part of that whole approach. And I think anyone who's worked in law enforcement or military or those types of security-oriented jobs or careers understands that, you're exposing yourself to danger, and there's a noble cause that comes with that, and that, you're doing things for the right reason, and that you're prepared accordingly. And so I think that all kind of comes into play into, like, I go on a call with my buddy, and I hear some woman in a house getting, smacked around or killed or whatever, and I look over at him and I go, hey man, this is what we get paid the little bucks for, right? Like, saddle up, kids, and we're going to go kick the door and we're going to do our thing. And I don't know that that's any different, right? Like in the line of work that we do. So
talk to us real quick about the dog at home. I know my federal partners in like Customs and Border Protection, I don't think they brought their dogs home. They kenneled them. But most police, sheriff's canine units, the dog goes home with the handler and lives with the family. And I think some people would be surprised to hear that, or they'd be freaked out thinking, oh, he's going to murder somebody because, he's a scary police dog. So I know your dog. I've met Blitz. He's a very good boy. He's perhaps the best boy. And he lives in your house with you. So I think people would be curious to know, do you feel like a certain sense of liability there? Like, oh my gosh, what if he bites the neighbor? What if he bites the UPS guy? Like, how does that work? And how does he interact with other dogs at your house?
So there's a few things to understand about this. The first is it goes back to that term management that I used earlier. And my first dog was not a nice dog. And he was not a dog that I would have around my kid, right? So if that's the dog that I deal with, then I have to manage that by keeping him separate. He lives in a kennel, he lives in a crate, and the relationship is between me and him, and he doesn't have to be a social creature, right? If he's that kind of dog. Now, my dog now happens to be very good with kids, and he's very friendly and very playful, and it's not a factor in the sense that he's not going to, out of quote unquote anger. Dogs don't really think that way, but his mode of aggression wouldn't be to fight somebody, but he is also a very driven creature. So if you have little kids running around acting like little bunny rabbits and squirrels, he might treat them accordingly. And so I still have to manage that. And if my kid's out in the yard and he's out, like, I got to make sure I have him under control, or at least closely supervised, depending on the circumstances. So that management thing comes into play. The other thing, as far as liability goes, is understanding that these dogs, people think that because, oh, it's an attack dog, he's a scary police dog, that he just runs around, seeing red all the time, and that he's just spring-loaded to jump into action and to be aggressive. And it's not really the case. He's still just a dog. Most of the things that we do in real life and in training are just a game to him. He doesn't perceive the dangers in many cases. I mean, sure, he has that pack mentality. If we're up against a guy, he will defend the pack. We have that going for us, sure. But I'm not in that state of mind at home. And as the pack leader, he knows that it's not time to fight unless dad says it's time to fight, right? So it's usually not a factor for most of us, for most of the guys in my unit. Again, there are dogs that are exceptions, and it's a case-by-case thing. But yeah, I mean, I live with my dog. He's part of the family. I think that's an important part of the relationship and the bonding process. And all dogs require management. Don't trick yourself into thinking that just because your dog is just a sniffer, quote unquote, or just a pet, quote unquote, that they're not capable of biting people and capable of aggression. Because if you think that way, you are incorrect.
So, fun story. We had a mature female German Shepherd, probably about 60 pounds. She was a very sweet dog. She had one of those barks that would scare the tweakers away. Back living in San Diego, they would, if they knocked, they would regret it. We have a church gathering in our home, in our backyard, and there's probably, I don't know, maybe 30, 35 people there. There's a good group of kids, smaller kids, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And they're running around in a circle. And Schatzi, our German Shepherd, recognizes them as some sort of herd creatures, and begins to nip at their heels and chase them around in a circle. Now, she wasn't being assaultive, for lack of a better word. She was literally just shepherding them. That's how she's wired. She had them in a group and had them going in a direction, nipping at their heels. All the other parents were terrified. Turns out she didn't hurt any of the kids, so that was a good outcome. Talk to us about SWAT training. Some places have a SWAT team or a special response team or whatever, but this is the group that the police call when the situation at hand is more than the regular police can deal with or manage or handle safely. One does not call the SWAT team willy-nilly. there's just probably certain parameters for your agency, like there was for mine, to either call them for a situation before it happens. So, for example, a high-risk warrant, someone's got a lot of guns or, a lot of drugs in the house, and you want to have them handle it in their their specialized way, their highly trained way. Or you have a situation where you have a barricaded suspect or some other issue that requires highly trained people who are trained in negotiating, trained in how to clear a building as a group. How long were you a police officer before you joined a SWAT team? And by the way, and talk to us about the selection process, because you don't just sign up for it and get it.
So it's all going to be agency specific, obviously. I can only speak to our team. I've talked to people from all over the country about their selection processes and their training, and there's really no the only thing consistent is the inconsistency, really,
right,
if we're honest. So for our team, I joined the police department in 2008, and I got on SWAT it's coming up on 9 years ago. So whatever year, 2013, does that sound right? 2000, yeah. We put a big emphasis on selection, which I think most teams do or should probably. The training, if you select the right people, you can. This is actually really true for dogs as well. You select the right dog, you can train them how to do anything you want. It's the same for people. You select the right people, you can teach them how to do just about anything,
sure,
right? So we put a really big emphasis on training and selecting the right people. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the things about being on a SWAT team. The training and the proficiency skills, there is a big emphasis there. The standards are higher in terms of physical fitness and your shooting qualification and your judgment and decision making and those kind of compressed time sort of environments. But, at the same time, don't fool yourself into thinking that just because you are on a SWAT team that you're doing things that are quote unquote more dangerous than just being a quote unquote patrol cop, right? Like just a patrol cop, because the reality, as we know, is that's where a lot of the crap goes down, is out in the field, right? So we have the benefit most of the time of, if SWAT's coming, we're rolling deep, right? We've got a whole bunch of tools and tricks up our sleeve, and we have resources just in numbers and volume. So it's not just a quality, it's also a quantity in and of itself.
Sure.
So all that comes with it. But that said, all the tools that we have, the guy behind those tools is the most important thing. And I think having a culture of accountability and high expectations and working on a high performing team where people aren't going to let you slide for stuff, and you are expected to own your mistakes with humility, and you're expected to call people out on their mistakes if necessary. There's a lot that goes into building that into the culture of an organization, or a subculture of an organization if you're talking about a team within a department. And that is a superpower, right? That organizational behavior stuff and the culture of your team is a superpower, and that's where we get our mojo from. And the reason I bring that up, and what's really cool about that, is it's not unique to, it's not reserved only for a SWAT team, right? You can do that within your patrol squad. You could do that with your fire company. You can do it with your family. If you have a group of friends that you go to the range with, or your church security group, or whatever it is, right? You can build that sense of culture and accountability and high expectations and all of that. So.
Yeah, me and a buddy of mine got transferred from one unit to another out in San Diego, and the unit we arrived at together, the morale was absolutely in the basement. Bad morale, bad attitudes, supervision, and the staff didn't get along at all. Working conditions weren't great, long hours, not a lot of understanding on the part of upper management. And I'm really proud that we were able to change that culture in about 6-8 months. The first thing I did was make up a unit logo and a banner and hung it up in our workspace. Like, this is who we are. This is who we are now, and just kind of get them a little bit more motivated. And the more motivated they got, the more management realized, okay, maybe we need to back off these guys a little bit. And just that 6 to 8 months of getting that turned around. How gratifying, by the way, to be able to help motivate your teammates, your coworkers, and in law enforcement especially, like the military, like the fire service, EMS, that esprit de corps, that sense of team is so important, because if you don't have that, really bad things can happen, and morale can suffer greatly, as well as discipline and good order. So,
yeah, and it starts again going back to kind of the point about you can do that with any group, with any team, with any organization. The other part of it is it's also about you and your own attitude towards things, right? You can turn your attitude around and influence the people around you. Those attitudes are contagious, good or bad. And so you can bring up the whole baseline as long as you're accountable for yourself.
Right. So, Mike, back in 2019, you were called to a scene of an ongoing incident, and there was a bad guy involved, and the bad guy did not want to go to jail, and you had to deploy your best boy, Blitz, in this situation. You want to walk us through that from the beginning?
Sure. So this guy was a serial bank robber. He was going around robbing banks, and the level of violence was starting to increase. He kind of went from just subtle robbery demands to implied weapon demands to displayed weapon. I can't remember if he displayed any weapons or he just implied them, but his behavior was beginning to escalate. And investigators got a tip about who this guy was because he was escalating, and he was starting to talk about, I'm not going back to prison. I'm going to shoot it out with the cops. And so this person became more and more concerned about the welfare, not only of the suspect, but also of the public and everyone else at large, right? So we got a tip, and we started working this guy, and they developed a case on him, and they finally said, okay, we think we got our guy. We think we know where he's at, and they called SWAT to help. And that's a big part of our job. We do high risk arrests, and there are times and places where we can go capture somebody at their house and serve it as a search warrant, surround the house, and try to get a peaceful resolution that way. And there are times where that's not going to be feasible, and the best way to do it is while they're out and about. And so we got set up, and without going into some of our sneaky tricks and tactics, we'll use a variety of methods to either while out in public driving around or staged in places where we can hide and be sneaky, look for an opportunity to confront a person who's wanted. This guy was particularly paranoid. His behavior showed it. He was running through alley, like this was a late night kind of operation, and he was going from point A to point B on foot, running through alleys, avoiding, aircraft, like random aircraft in the air, and cars that would drive by that were totally benign to him. Of course, we were watching him the whole time, but he didn't know that, although his paranoia, I suppose, suggested it.
Or did he?
Yeah, exactly. And so it was a challenging operation to get an opportunity to jump this guy. And so finally, he got within probably 30 or so yards of us from our hiding place, walking down the street, and he was walking towards us, and he decided to turn and go back the other direction, probably because, I don't know, either one, he just knew it was us, or two, his paranoia was, working strong. But decided to turn back, go the other direction, and we decided to take that opportunity. It was the best chance that we had, and so we jumped out, we confronted him, he ran away, and we sent Blitz to go after him. That's the nuts and bolts of how this went down.
So you were at a public place, and let me just digress for one moment. Folks listening at home, the reason for this sort of thing is that you see these warrants that go bad, and then someone ends up getting shot and killed, or a cop gets shot and killed because of the inherent danger of entering a residence with the person inside doesn't want you to enter, and they're a hardened criminal. The idea here is to minimize the chances for a bad outcome. That's why you want to take somebody away from their house, preferably. What comes to mind for me is Waco. I feel like if they would have just picked dude up in town when he was picking up his Wonder Bread, we might have avoided a huge tragedy. So there's a lot of hard-won information here for LE as to why they do things the way they do them. So the point of this was to get him out in public when he's not in a car, when he's not in his house, surrounded by all of his guns or whatever, and hopefully get a peaceful resolution to this. So you yell police, he runs, Blitz goes after him. What happens then?
Yeah, so I want to hit on something that you said there about, like, the Waco incident is a great example. David Koresh, if he was out buying milk or something and we could have got him there, we could have avoided this big problem. There are times where their house is a perfect venue and opportunity to do it, and there are times where there aren't. In this case, a big part of it was he was in an apartment complex, and one, we didn't know which apartment he was staying in, but two, we did know that wherever he was staying was not his apartment, so there were other people presumed to be there, and it was a hard spot that we could protect if he did decide to shoot it out with the cops, for example, that we could protect the other people in the complex from that if it went down. So those are absolutely good points, and I want to just highlight that, a big thing that comes into all of this is managing risk. You can never eliminate it. You could just manage it.
Right.
And so usually using the element of surprise goes a long way in preventing a bad outcome. And so that's kind of what led us here. So yeah, so the guy was a pretty good distance away still when we did try to confront him. And to be clear, we tried to close that distance before we actually said or did anything, but he was on us, right? He was street savvy enough, to his credit. He knew we were there. He saw us coming and immediately took off running. And so the gig was up, right? So before he makes it into the neighborhood where he could potentially take somebody hostage or go barricade somewhere or something like that, we needed to take that opportunity to apprehend him and not let him get away. And that's where Blitz came in. I went back and I retraced the steps on this. Blitz's total pursuit distance was about 140 yards. And if you think about the speed that a Belgian Malinois can close with a bad guy, it gives you an idea of how far away he was already when we finally sent Blitz and how much ground he had to cover before he actually got this guy to the ground. So we lost sight of them around the corner. Blitz has a missile lock on the bad guy as he's running away. They make it around the corner of a trailer. Blitz is on his tail in pursuit. We kind of clear our way up to him following the yelling and the screaming. I could hear Blitz making some noise. I can hear the guy making some noise. And I see the guy hitting the dog, which is not an uncommon thing, unfortunately. It's not an everyday thing. 9 out of 10 times, people that are getting bit by a police dog are saying, okay, get him off. And they're super cooperative, super fast.
This guy has a lot to lose. He knows that.
Sure. And there's also a natural fight or flight response, right? So some people will respond by trying to hit the dog. And so from what I could see, given the lighting and everything else that we had going on, he was punching the dog. So I walked up and I punched him and he fell back. And at that point he started yelling, okay, please don't shoot me. He was still kind of kicking for a while. So it's kind of a interesting thing that people do sometimes. Incongruent body language and verbal language. We get him into custody. I take Blitz off. Blitz was on his leg, and I pull him back, and I see an object on the ground next to the guy that is some kind of sharp object. It wasn't like an actual knife. It looked like half of a pair of scissors is the best way I can describe it. Some kind of improvised shank or something. But some sharp object that had some blood on the end of it. And I look down at Blitz and I start doing kind of a wound sweep on him. And Blitz is still pissed off and barking at the guy. Blitz doesn't even care. He's just doing canine things. Mm-hmm. And so I realized that Blitz is bleeding from the neck. So I go, hey guys, you good with him? I'm gonna have to go. Yeah. So we got him around the corner. I started assessing his injuries. We threw him in another canine handler's car and got him to the vet. He went in for surgery, had a couple wounds that needed to get little wound vacuums in, got some stitches. The stab wound, the big one, missed his jugular by just a couple of millimeters, so he got pretty lucky. But otherwise, Blitz was fine. He was, like I said, he still wanted to fight. He wasn't fazed by it at all until he got hit with heavy meds for sedation. He was off work for a couple of weeks while the stitches were in, just so we didn't, cause any infections and that sort of thing. And then he's back at work, and he's been back ever since. So he's good to go. Bad guys in jail.
All right, folks, on the Active Self-Protection podcast, we eschew the evils of foul language because I know your kids will be listening, but just cover their ears for 1 second. Blitz is a badass. That dog is just the best dog ever. I wish you could all see a picture of him. We'll have to figure out a way to get a picture of Blitz in front of the nice people who are listening. So that ended well, but it could have ended very poorly. And I think this really demonstrates perfectly why these canine units are so important. They're so critical to the mission of any law enforcement agency. Otherwise, it would have been Mike and his human partner chasing this guy. And there's a very good chance, almost 100% chance, that once they caught up with Dude, he would have produced this sharp object and would have stabbed a human being and may have had a very different outcome, because human beings don't react the same way a dog does after being stabbed. So I think Blitz protected you and your partners that day from some potential harm. And that's why we call him the best boy. So let's talk for a moment about... Go ahead.
And notably the public, I think.
Yeah.
You know, the big thing in this, given the distance and stuff away, I'm wearing 50 pounds of gear when I go do this, right? And this guy, he had a gun in his backpack, but I think it ended up being an airsoft gun or something like that. But we did find he did have a real pistol. I just don't know if it was with him or he left it back at whatever apartment he came from. I'm not sure what the outcome of that was, but you know, sure, it could have been a pistol. It happened to be a knife in this case, but the big thing is, given the circumstances, odds are greater that he would have gotten away.
Right.
And now our window to have captured him is gone. And so at best, he's going to continue robbing banks or whatever. And at worst, again, he's going to go hole up somewhere and take a hostage or something like that because he's desperate and he knows that we're on him. Right. So, you know, to me, that's the bigger takeaway, is that without Blitz, I'm not a very good runner. I'll be the first to tell you. I am not confident that I would have caught that guy. I am confident to what you said, that had it been a cop, that he would have also been stabbed. I don't think that, given the layout of this as he was getting attacked by the dog, that he was able to go retrieve that knife. My assumption is that he probably had it in his hand or is otherwise readily available. So sure, I'm sure that he could have stabbed the person if that was his desire. But again, importantly, he could have gotten away. And I think that's also a bad outcome.
Yeah, or like you said, taking a hostage, in which case now you're dealing with a hostage taker with half a pair of scissors against two cops with guns in the middle of the night, amped up, you know, adrenaline pumping through your veins, hoping for a good outcome. And the chances of a good outcome at that point are dwindling. Let's talk just for a moment about being a law enforcement in Arizona. Two stark differences between California and Arizona for me is... First, well, actually, one similarity is how professional the law enforcement agencies are, generally speaking, that I've interacted with, both there and here, both California and Arizona. But the response to coming across an average citizen who's carrying a loaded firearm is very, very different, partially because of the culture, because of the gun laws and the difficulty of getting a CCW anywhere in California, especially in Southern California. You're constantly probably interacting with people you're pulling over or stopping on the street, not constantly, but certainly more frequently than other places when they're carrying a loaded firearm. What's your response when you pull somebody over, they go, hey, not for nothing, but I have a Glock appendix. How do you respond to that? And going a little further, how would you recommend an armed citizen stop by the police, interact with the police in that moment? Because I know a lot of folks listening to the show are concealed carriers.
Well, most of the time when people tell me that, if they just offer that, hey, officer, just so you know, I have a gun. It's right here. I just don't touch it. Right. Just leave it where it is.
Right.
And normally those interactions are going to be fine. I might do things a little bit differently in the realm of, rather than go back to my car out of sight to run your name, I might just do it right there over the radio. You know, depending on the circumstances and kind of the vibe that I'm getting from the people in the car. But it frankly doesn't make me very uncomfortable. I walk into every interaction with the assumption that people are somehow dangerous. That's not always because of guns. It could be because they are just better at fighting than me, you know?
Right.
And it says a lot usually if someone's going to offer that up, what their state of mind is in terms of their desire to cooperate. And, we can have a respectful armed interaction because I'm not there to hurt anybody. And generally speaking, they're not there to hurt me. So to me, it's just a non-issue. I don't, some cops might view it differently. Some cops might take a different approach. Certainly it might be the approach of some officers to want to have that person out of the car and where they can see them and those sorts of things. But to me, again, it's a case-by-case thing, and I don't feel very uncomfortable about it because they've already made me more comfortable just knowing that they are armed instead of just me having to work off the assumption that they probably are, right? As far as recommendations for people who are interacting with law enforcement that are armed, I think offering it up, everyone's got their own feelings about like, well, I'm never going to say anything unless they ask me. That's fine. I mean, that's your right, I guess. Again, I don't see why there's anything wrong with having a respectful armed encounter together, but that's your right, I guess, if that's what you want to do. If you're asked about it, I recommend that you declare it. The biggest thing that I've seen a number of times, and this is just a natural human reaction, I don't know why people do it, is if I say something like, do you have any weapons in the car? And they go, yeah, right over here. They start digging for it. I'm like, no, don't do that. Yeah. The big thing, I think, is just to be calm and not make a big thing about it. I see a lot of people, even if they are not armed, get super spooked in some interactions with the cops, and they're very rigid and they're very like, their hands are iron fisted on the steering wheel. And it's like, man, you can relax. You don't have to be a robot about this. Everything's going to be okay. Let's have a face-to-face interaction and just communicate like humans. It's going to be fine. And I admit that there are many of my peers who have not done their part to keep the interaction as amicable as can be. We all have things to work on, of course. But best thing you can do is just, be relatively calm, relatively still, answer their questions. If you are asked to grab something like your ID or your wallet or your papers, maybe start with okay, they're right over there in the glove box before you reach for it, so they kind of have an idea of what you're doing. But I wouldn't overcomplicate it. I really don't think that anyone needs to follow a script. I really don't think that anyone needs to do a kata or a certain kind of dance or anything. I certainly don't remember. This is one that I've seen in the past is I'll walk up to the car and there'll be a cleared out, emptied magazine separated from the gun, slide locked back up on the dashboard to show me that the gun is clear. Don't do that. That's also a no-go for me. You have to assume that I might be approaching the car or my partner might be approaching the car while that thing is still in your hand. I don't recommend that at all. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Mike, but that's my big advice is just to keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Be calm and just talk.
Yeah. And as far as whether or not you have to or you should declare the fact that you have a concealed firearm on you, that's up to the individual person. I've heard people say, well, I don't have to tell the officer, so I won't. I mean, it's entirely up to you. This is your interaction with the police. You want it to go well. You want to not get shot during an interaction because of a misunderstanding. I'm of the camp that, generally speaking, you let the officer or deputy know, carrying a firearm. Usually you get that kind of response. But with that said, you mentioned there's people, you coworkers who haven't helped with our public perception, and I say this all the time. I've probably worked with, not as an officer of or deputy of, but worked on task forces with probably 100 agencies in my career. And every one of those agencies has like 5% of the officers or deputies or agents or whatever who aren't very good at their job, and they have no interpersonal skills, and they're jerks. And unfortunately, the jerks are the ones that are going to pull you over for kind of a lame reason, and they're going to give you a hard time, and they're going to be rude and disrespectful. The reason you don't meet most of the cool cops like me and Mike is that we're not bothering regular people. We're looking for actual criminals. So when you have that interaction on the side of the road, just know that We don't like that guy either. All right, moving on.
Can I throw one thing on there?
Absolutely.
The other thing is, guys like me and Mike might be looking for some really bad guy, and that doesn't mean that we're batting 1,000 on that, right? So just because we end up stopping you, and we might ask some questions that feel pointed, give them the benefit of the doubt and saying, like, I know that, like, I don't know you, man. I might ask you some questions because you're driving in a part of town where we've been having burglary problems at night, or, because I'm looking for a guy in a silver sedan and you're driving a silver sedan. It doesn't mean you're the guy, right? And the best thing that you can do is, again, just be calm, communicate, interact. And if the guy is a jerk, if he is that guy, again, like Mike said, yeah, we don't like him, but by all means, feel free to talk to a supervisor or something. We don't need that, man. And, if it's someone on my department, tell me and I'll talk to that guy, because I don't need him acting that way either.
One last thing I want to talk about, and then we want to get your information as far as where folks can find you on social media and your podcasts and stuff. John and I have done a number of badge cam videos recently where in one there was a young man who suspected there was a domestic violence incident going on at his house. He meets the cops out front. And they're like, we need to go inside and check on your girlfriend. And he's like, nope, you can't come to my house without a warrant. And they end up in a knockdown, drag out with the guy, and they end up going in the house anyway and checking on the girlfriend. Or you think about the side of the road where the officer deputy says, yeah, I'm going to search your car, step out of the car, whatever the case may be. And the person doesn't perceive that that's justified in their eyes. The law enforcement officer is doing something wrong or incorrect or illegal. Talk to us for just a moment about the fact that you're not going to win the confrontation on the side of the road or in front of your house from a civilian perspective, that it's best to let the cop do whatever the cop's going to do. And then if the cop's in the wrong down the road, you're going to be able to remedy that civilly or through his department discipline or whatever else the case may be. Because like I said, you're not going to win that side of the road argument. Your lawyer's not coming to the traffic stop. Your lawyer's not coming to the door of your house in that moment to give you legal advice. So what do you recommend to people who feel like maybe this action by the police isn't justified? What do I do in this moment?
Well, I think there's certainly always room to, again, have a calm adult conversation about things. And so you can certainly ask the officer, hey, officer, could I talk to you for just a minute? I just want to make sure this is not a consensual thing. You're doing this regardless of my input, and kind of get that on the record, as it were. Especially most cops nowadays are wearing body-worn cameras. You can even ask something like, do you mind if I record this interaction? And some cops are going to give you attitude or whatever about that, but it's fine. But again, you can ask those things, right? And you can get those things on the table. And if the cop is going to do whatever they're going to do, trust me when I say that there will be far more repercussions than, perhaps the inconvenience that day or that night, if you decide to pursue them, to include things like you could file a complaint with that officer's agency. There are potentially civil liability consequences to be had. And if there is an arrest or something made, the accountability of the district attorney or county attorney in that area should hopefully be looking at those cases and saying, no, I don't think this was a good search. We're not going to proceed with this, and that's going to go away anyway, right? But all that being said, I found myself in a number of conversations with, the types of people who are very, very serious about their rights. And to be super clear, you do you, man. I'm not here to discredit anyone's civil rights. By all means, exercise them to the fullest, right? But recognize when you're in a pissing match, right? When it's a contest of egos, you're probably going to lose more often than not. Recognize when your own ego is getting in the way of those things. Like if you're just pissed off about your rights, maybe you're not coming across as diplomatic as you could be when you ask the officer, hey, just to be clear, I want to make sure I'm not free to leave and this is not a consensual search, right? Like if you can ask that politely and they go, oh man, all right, look, right? Maybe we could slow this down a little bit and start back at square one. And that includes if you are having that like negative interaction or you came out hot for whatever reason, to to ask them, hey, can we start over for a second? I was a jerk. My bad. Let's start back at square one, right? And just kind of do that reset. All of this assumes that you're not hiding actual criminal behavior or activity, right? Because the interpretation of reasonable suspicion or probable cause to stop somebody, make an arrest, and potentially conduct a search is not really for the perspective of the person being stopped or searched at that point, right? Because that falls under the lawful authority of law enforcement. So their interpretation of things on some level in the field is up to them. And that doesn't mean that they are infallible, that they couldn't be wrong from time to time. But you have to recognize that just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean that it's not correct, right? Or correct enough. So if you don't have anything to hide, then it shouldn't be as big of a deal, because they're going to inconvenience you. They're going to come up empty-handed and not find anything. And that is going to bolster your argument for whatever complaint, or whether it's a legal complaint or just a complaint with their department or supervisor or whatever, in the aftermath.
Well said. A good place to end. Mike, thanks so much for being here. Where could people find your podcast?
TacticalTangents.com is our website. You can find all of our episodes there. We're on just about every outlet, I think. We're not on YouTube because we're doing mostly audio only format. So you might see us there eventually, but primarily Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could find us probably wherever. I'll challenge you this. If there's an app that you can't find us on that is podcast specific, please shoot me a message and I will try to get up on that.
And where would they find you?
My email is mike@tacticaltangents.com. You can also find us, all of our social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're at TacTangents. We try to go out of our way to respond to messages and comments, so you can find us there. There's a contact form on our website. That'll come straight to me. You can go there. But yeah.
Folks, don't forget to stick around, listen to my interview with Steve Gutowski. Always a good time. Tactical Tangents is the podcast. Mike Doyle, my friend, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, gang, back with us again for another week. Our friend Stephen Gutowski of the Gutowski Files. Okay, I made that up. He is the founder of thereload.com and the host of the weekly Reload podcast. Stephen, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, but yeah, be careful with my branding. That website URL was very expensive.
Gutowski Files. Yeah, I actually every week I think to myself, I want to get some cool, like, old school journalism-y sounding music, to intro you to, but that's maybe next week. We'll see. We're kind of busy. I just got done on his show, so go check that out, the weekly Reload podcast, where it'll probably be his most popular episode ever, I'm guessing, since I was on it. I mean, how could it not
Biggest
be?
draw yet. We had Charles Cook from National Review and the Atlantic's Adam Serwer, but I think Mike Williver,
amateurs,
top billing.
Never heard of him.
That's gonna be the big show. That's gonna be the one that does it for us.
Gonna blow it up. So Stephen,
but I do think it was actually a really good episode.
Outstanding. Well, there you go. Well, go check it out. Go check out all his episodes, ladies and gentlemen. What else is there in the podcast space that you want to listen to other than his dulcet tones telling you about the miserable news about the Second Amendment lately? So this is some news that could be taken as good or bad news, depending on how you look at it and how deeply you look at it. But there is an article up at thereload.com entitled NRA Finished 2020 in the Black Due to Massive Spending Cuts After Revenue Falls and Legal Costs Skyrocket. We've already talked in this space about Wayne LaPierre and his sort of the very bizarre management of the NRA lately, with things like him filing for bankruptcy without talking to the board first, then them retroactively approving it, and them reelecting him despite all this crazy stuff that's gone on. This New York debacle with the lawsuit, and then of course all the apparent embezzlement on the part of Mr. LaPierre, for lack of a better term. We'll call it another word for it. It's politer than embezzlement, but
diversion of funds,
redirecting funds, for his own personal stuff. So talk to us about, Stephen, how the NRA managed, despite all these troubles, to finish in the black in 2020.
Well, I mean, it's kind of straightforward. They just cut their spending almost entirely across the board here compared to 2019. There were some areas where spending was up. They spent more on legislative programs compared to 2019, because 2020 was obviously a presidential election year. although their spending there was down compared to 2018 and 2016. So, basically the way they've stayed profitable or in the black at least, right? They're a nonprofit, is by cutting their spending, cutting their staff, cutting everything basically, except for legislative programs and legal expenses. Some of what you just talked about there is reflected in the legal spending. They've spent almost $125 million on legal, audit, and tax costs over the last 3 years, which is an incredible increase compared to what they were spending before all of the allegations came out and they had to deal with this New York lawsuit.
If you're an NRA member out there, just paying the basic annual dues, I think you'd like to hope that when you send off your check, you go on the website and redo your re-up your NRA membership, or when you decide to give a couple extra bucks to help them fight these constant assaults against the Second Amendment, you'd like to think your money is going towards, I don't know, doing those things and not so much to cleaning up the mess of Mr. LaPierre and his board. So it's something to think about the next time you're going to write him a check, folks. We've talked in this space about how we're worried for the future of the National Rifle Association, because if they manage to keep spiraling downward, who's going to replace them? Stephen, we talked about this recently about, look, there's a lot of other small groups out there, but they're just not going to be enough to replace them in the short term.
Yeah, even with the losses that they've seen to revenue over the last couple of years, I mean, they're down 8 figures from 2019 to 2020 and $78 million from 2018. So they've shrunk quite a bit, but they're still the largest group out there, gun rights or gun control group. They're bigger than everybody still. They're bigger than most of the popular gun rights alternative groups that you know of combined. So they're still the elephant in the room, but they are shrinking significantly, and they're spending more and more money on their legal costs compared to things like, safety training programs and member services and legislative programs. So they're spending a lot less on what people would associate with the NRA and spending a lot more on trying to, save themselves from this dissolution lawsuit.
So, Stephen, you know more about the NRA inner workings and the politics than anyone I know. So I'm going to ask you to take your journalist hat off for just a second and put on your opinion hat, and tell our listeners, what do you think needs to happen moving forward for the NRA to not fall off a cliff financially and in every other way?
Well, I don't want to give my personal take on what people should do, but clearly you can read the numbers here. You can see what they're spending on. And if people don't like that, they can either boycott the NRA, which a lot of people are doing by not giving them any money anymore, which is probably a significant reason why their revenue fell. Although, as the NRA told me, there's also the factor of the pandemic, which hurt a lot of nonprofits. And
Sure.
That's a fair point to make, frankly. They had to cancel a lot of their fundraising events because of COVID. So there's one particularly reasonable explanation for why the revenue's down. But another one is that they've had a lot of internal turmoil. There's a lot of people upset with the group, and a lot of people have stopped giving them money. And so that's one option people can take. They can, if you've been a member long enough to have voting rights at the NRA, obviously you could vote for candidates who for the board who oppose the current strategy they've been using to operate the organization. You could run for the board yourself. You could sign people's petitions who are running. It is fairly difficult to get on the board if you don't already have the board's approval, given the way that the nomination process works there. But it is possible through petition. Some people have done it. And, other than that, it is frankly difficult if you are someone who believes that Wayne LaPierre should not be in charge of the NRA and doesn't like the current course that they're on. It is a hard path to reform it from the inside, but it's not impossible necessarily. And so you could take that view. And to me, when I look at things, from the outside as a reporter, it's kind of surprising to me how little interest there is in doing that, or in either supporting Wayne or in ousting him. There's been obviously some concerted efforts to do that. If you've seen a number of board members resign or try to file interventions in the legal cases, whether the bankruptcy or the New York case, and you've seen some organization of members around the idea. But like, I was at the members meeting, we discussed this before on a previous episode, and they only had maybe 150 people show up to that meeting, whether they were, and most of them were in support of Wayne, but which is still obviously not a big showing either way. And so there just hasn't been like any really, well-funded or coordinated campaign to reform the NRA from the inside. And there hasn't really been, a great outpouring of popular support among members for Wayne either, as far as like that you can visibly see in person. So, again, the pandemic has an effect on all these things. Maybe it would have been different if the annual meeting had happened. Maybe you'd see what the average members who attend the annual meeting really think if they had the meeting, but they couldn't because of COVID and all these companies dropping out from the exhibits, which you're starting to see with the industry trade show as well, SHOT Show. SIG's not going to that. So, I don't know. It's hard to watch though, and feel like there's just not that much interest in it from many people on either side of the fight over Wayne.
So the next time there is an NRA annual meeting for the members, folks, if you're a member and you can make it there, or somehow make your concerns known, that would be great, because it's only going to happen from the inside that this thing gets fixed. And we don't want to see the NRA go away. It's the biggest game in town. The most money and the most reach and the most name recognition.
And look, you can also get the NRA leadership's point of view in my piece. I quoted them at length there, trying to be as fair as possible to everybody involved here. But the numbers are what they are, and people should know them.
Folks, if you're lamenting the lack of down the middle, sane and sober reporting on the Second Amendment, you have got to go over to the Reload and get a membership. They're not expensive, and it helps Stephen do the phenomenal work he's doing. And Stephen, it's always nice to see you, and thanks for coming on.
Hey, I love doing these, so I'll see you again next week.
Take care.